Milestone report released this morning shows food banks across the country are experiencing overwhelming demand as inflation takes a toll. The report from Food Banks Canada shows the highest number since it began collecting data in 1989. Among the findings, there were nearly 2 million visits to food banks last March. Food bank use among working people continues to rise to record levels so far this year, and 1/3 of food bank users are children, representing over 600,000 food bank visits in March of 2023. The head of the Daily Bread Food Bank in Canada says governments need to do more to ease the cost of living. Joining me now to discuss this report further is Food Banks Canada CEO Kirstin Beardsley. Kirstin, thank you so much for being with us this morning. This is such an important report, and it really highlights the struggles that Canadians are going through right now. Before we get into the nitty-gritties, can you just explain why we're talking about March specifically?
Of course. So we have, as a history, as you said, since the 80s, we've been collecting data as food banks across the country and looking at March, which tends to be a sort of typical month. You're not heading towards the holidays or looking at the summer or the fall. It's sort of a typical month in food banking use. So we've used it as a benchmark for, as you said, decades now to see how many people across this country are having to make that difficult choice to turn to food banks.
Got it. So it provides that snapshot in time. So food bank visits have gone up nearly 80% since 2019, since before the pandemic. Describe for us what the food banks are dealing with right now.
It's really tough out there. So food bankers are the strongest people I know. But this level of growth, I mean, anyone in industry, anyone in a business knows that this level of growth presents itself with a lot of challenges. And food bankers are working flat out to make sure they've got the food, to make sure they've got the volunteers, to make sure that everyone who comes to our doors receives what they need to support themselves and their families. We have never worked this hard. We have never had to meet this level of need right across the country.
And I know it may seem obvious to some, but I do need to ask the question, what factors are contributing to this dramatic increase in food bank use?
Right, so what we're seeing is a broken social safety net that has been suffering from decades of social policy neglect. We haven't seen the investments in society that we need to see. And that's, of course, now meeting, as you've been talking about, the affordability crisis, the cost of living crisis. People simply can't make their budgets meet their needs. And so we're seeing a new wave of folks, many folks who are turning to a food bank for the very first time in their lives, never thought they'd be in this position, but their monthly income simply isn't stretching far enough for them to buy food for themselves or for their kids.
Yeah, and you hit on an important point there. A lot of people going to food banks are employed. They do have jobs.
Yeah, that was a shocking number in the report. So that we're at 17% of people using food banks have employment as their primary source of income. It means that the jobs aren't stretching far enough to meet the costs that we're seeing out there right now, whether that's housing, utilities, or food. People just can't make it all work. So that number has been steadily climbing, and that speaks to something not working in society when working folks have to go to the food bank.
So how do food banks get the food that is on their shelves? What needs to be done to start fixing this issue? How can people help?
Well, it's really going to take all of us in society. So the food comes from a variety of sources. We get food from retailers. We get a lot of donations in from industry. Of course, people do food drives. Food banks right now actually are purchasing more food than they ever have to meet this growing demand. So it costs a lot more to run a food bank right now. But what it's really going to take is government action. And what I think is that means all of us have to lend a part. If the rest of the country can get as shocked as we are in food banking about these numbers and as angry as we are, we can make politicians take action. We need to see our social safety net fixed. We need to see investments in affordable housing. We cannot continue to support this level of growth right across the country.
Kirstin Beardsley is the CEO of Food Banks Canada. Thank you so much for being with us to discuss this very important report.